338,000 men standing in the sea, not running, not fighting, standing in orderly queues that stretched from the burning dunes of northern France into the cold water of the English Channel, waiting for boats that might never come, while the most powerful military machine ever assembled in human history closed in from three sides. This is the story the history books call a miracle. But here is what the history books leave out. While those men stood in the water, 5 people sitting around a table in London were deciding whether to hand them to Adolf Hitler. While a concrete breakwater that was never designed to hold a single ship was secretly becoming the instrument of their salvation, a retired admiral working in a tunnel carved into chalk cliffs was building the impossible from whatever he could find. And while a German general stood on a hill and could literally see the town walls of Dunkirk through his binoculars, with his tanks already across the last canal, someone gave him an order to stop. That order has never been fully explained. What it made possible defies calculation. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments, did you know that Britain came within a single cabinet vote of surrendering to Hitler? Because most people have no idea. Stay until the end. What you are about to discover changes everything you think you know about how the Second World War was won. To understand what happened on the beaches of Dunkirk in late May of 1940, you first have to understand the world that created it, a world so intoxicated with its own assumptions that it had stopped being able to see what was directly in front of it. The catastrophe did not begin on the sand. It began 8 months earlier, in the silence of the phony war, in the comfortable headquarters of men who believed they already knew how the next battle would unfold. After Germany invaded Poland in September of 1939 and Britain and France declared war, something strange happened. Nothing. For 8 months, from October of 1939 to May of 1940, the two sides faced each other across the Franco-German border in a state of armed paralysis that the newspapers mockingly called the phony war. The British Expeditionary Force, 10 divisions of Britain's entire professional army, was stationed in northern France alongside the French. They trained, they dug, they waited. As the months passed without a German assault, a dangerous complacency settled into the Allied high command like damp into old stone. The French Supreme Commander, General Maurice Gamelin, was a man of the previous war. He had studied the German advance of 1914, built his entire defensive doctrine around its repetition, and constructed the Maginot Line, a vast fortification stretching along the Franco-German border, specifically to channel any future invasion into Belgium, where the best Allied divisions would be waiting. His colleague, the legendary Marshal Philippe Pétain, had surveyed the Ardennes forest to the north of the Maginot Line and declared it impenetrable to armored vehicles. Too steep, too dense, too narrow for tanks. The forest would protect their left flank. The Maginot Line would protect their right. In the center, a gap of approximately 50 miles of lightly defended territory that everyone, through the quiet consensus of generals who should have known better, had agreed was simply not the kind of ground an army could cross at speed. A French staff officer recorded in his diary on the eve of the German offensive that the position felt solid. He had studied the maps. He trusted the line. He had no reason not to. That trust was the trap. On the German side, a man named Erich von Manstein looked at that gap and recognized it for what it actually was. Not an obstacle, a corridor. Von Manstein, serving as Chief of Staff of Army Group A, submitted a plan to the German High Command that his superiors promptly rejected as reckless fantasy. He proposed driving 3 Panzer Corps through the Ardennes, the impenetrable forest, crossing the Meuse River at Sedan, and racing northwest toward the English Channel at maximum speed. The gamble was audacious to the point of apparent insanity. The armored columns would outpace their own infantry, supply lines would stretch to breaking point, and flanks would be left naked to counterattack. If the French reacted quickly enough and struck at the corridor from north or south, they could sever the entire German spearhead and end the war in Germany's defeat. Von Manstein's superiors understood this. What they failed to understand was that the French would not react in time. On the 17th of February, 1940, Adolf Hitler met with von Manstein and approved a modified version of the plan. The sickle had been drawn. Nobody on the Allied side knew it yet. The morning of the 10th of May changed everything. Germany invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg simultaneously, and the Allies did precisely what Germany needed them to do. They rushed their best forces north into Belgium to counter what appeared to be the main thrust. By the evening of the 12th of May, 3 German panzer corps had crossed the Franco-Belgian border through the Ardennes and were looking down at the Meuse River. The impenetrable forest had been penetrated in 48 hours. On the 13th, Heinz Guderian's panzers crossed the Meuse at Sedan. The French Ninth Army, assigned to hold that sector, came apart almost immediately. A gap opened in the Allied line. The gap became a breach. The breach became a catastrophe. Within a week, German armored columns had driven northwest with a velocity that left Allied headquarters unable to process the reports arriving on their tables. General Gamelin was replaced on the 19th of May by General Maxime Weygand, a man who arrived to find he had inherited not a crisis to be managed, but a collapse already in motion. On the 20th of May, German panzers reached the English Channel coast. The sickle had closed. Every Allied force north of the German corridor, the British Expeditionary Force, the Belgian Army, 3 French armies, was now cut off from the rest of France. At the northern edge of the trap, barely visible through the smoke of burning villages, lay a small port town with a long sand beach and some old fortifications. Dunkirk. General John Vereker, the 6th Viscount Gort and commander of the British Expeditionary Force, absorbed the scale of the disaster with a clarity that his superiors in London were not yet willing to match. London was still issuing orders to attack southward, to cut through the German corridor and re-establish contact with French forces below. Gort looked at the map. He looked at the state of his divisions, many fighting continuously for 10 days. He looked at the gap opening on his eastern flank as the Belgian army began its disintegration. On the 23rd of May, without consulting London, without consulting the French, acting on his own judgment alone, he ordered his forces to withdraw toward the coast. The decision infuriated the French, who had not been told. It would poison relations between the two nations for years. It was also exactly right. The roads north to the coast had become something no training exercise had prepared a soldier to navigate. Men who had been retreating under fire for days moved along routes choked with civilian refugees, families with carts, children, livestock, all driven by the same terror, all flowing in the same direction. Equipment burned in the ditches. Lorries were pushed off the roads to keep the columns moving. Guns were being destroyed by their own crews because there were no horses left to move them. Behind those retreating men, in the fields and farmyards of northern France, lay 475 tanks, 38,000 vehicles, 2,500 guns. The entire material foundation of Britain's land war, abandoned in a week. Before those men reached the beach, before the evacuation could even begin, A payment was being made on their behalf that almost no one in Britain would later remember. The port of Calais, 60 kilometers southwest of Dunkirk, was the last obstacle between Guderian's armored spearhead and the corridor the British Expeditionary Force needed to reach safety. Churchill sent a message to the garrison there, 3 battalions of the Rifle Brigade, the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, a contingent of French troops, telling them to hold, not to be rescued, not to withdraw, to hold, knowing that the Germans would almost certainly overrun them, because every hour they held was an hour in which the Dunkirk perimeter could be strengthened and the escape organized. The men of Calais fought for 3 days. They lost 400 soldiers killed. They bought the time they were asked to buy at the price they were asked to pay. Their names are not spoken in the same breath as the miracle that followed. They are the foundation the miracle stood on. On the 24th of May, something happened that no one on the Allied side understood at the time, and that historians have argued over ever since. Guderian's 1st Panzer Division had already built bridges across the Ia Canal, the last significant water obstacle between his armor and Dunkirk. His vehicles were moving. He stood on elevated ground and could see the town walls. 1 British battalion stood between him and the port. An order arrived from Army Group A under General Gerd von Rundstedt. The tanks must halt at the Ia Canal. The advance would not continue. The reasons remain contested. Von Rundstedt had received reports suggesting tank losses across the recent advance were as high as 50%, an exaggeration since most losses were mechanical breakdowns repairable within hours, not combat casualties. He worried about the marshy terrain around Dunkirk, unsuitable for armor. He worried about flanks stretched dangerously thin. On the morning of the 24th, Hitler visited von Rundstedt's headquarters and confirmed the halt. Luftwaffe. Field Marshal Hermann Göring had been lobbying Hitler directly for the right to finish the trapped Allied forces with air power alone, arguing his bombers could destroy the men on the beaches without risking a single additional tank. Hitler agreed. Guderian later wrote that the order arrived containing the instruction that Dunkirk was to be left to the Luftwaffe. His men, who had already crossed the canal, were ordered back. The last natural barrier between the German army and 338,000 Allied soldiers had been deliberately left unguarded. The halt order would hold for 48 hours. That interval was the hinge on which the entire history of the war turned. In the tunnels beneath Dover Castle, 30 meters below the chalk cliffs of the English coast, a retired admiral named Bertram Home Ramsay was looking at a problem whose arithmetic refused to resolve. Ramsay had been born on the 20th of January, 1883, at Hampton Court Palace, and had joined the Royal Navy at the age of 14. He was not a man given to self-promotion. He was a man given to precision, to logistics, to the meticulous coordination of complex systems under extreme pressure. Skills the Royal Navy had rewarded with a distinguished career right up until 1935, when a dispute with the commander-in-chief of the Home Fleet over fleet staff management became irreconcilable, and Ramsay was placed on the retired list as a vice admiral. The Navy had discarded exactly the man it would most desperately need 5 years later. When war returned in 1939, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, supported Ramsay's recall to service. He was appointed Flag Officer Dover and given responsibility for Channel operations. It was from a room in the Dover tunnels that had once housed an electrical generator, called a dynamo, that Ramsay now received orders to plan and execute the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from the beaches of France. The operation would take the generator's name. He was told to plan for 2 days. The Admiralty estimated 20,000 to 30,000 men might be rescued before enemy action terminated the operation. There were more than 330,000 men waiting on the beach. Ramsay identified 3 possible routes across the channel. Route Z was 39 miles, direct, recently swept for mines, and eliminated almost immediately because German artillery now ranged over its entire length. Route X was 55 miles, but threaded through shoals and minefields, restricting it to daylight operations at reduced speed. That left Route Y, an 87-mile course curving east to avoid German-laid minefields before looping back to Dunkirk. Nearly twice the distance of the route they could not use. Every ship crossing on Route Y would take twice as long. Ramsay noted the constraint and began assembling every vessel he could reach. On the 27th of May, the small craft section of the British Ministry of Shipping began telephoning boat builders and marina operators along the south and east coasts of England, requisitioning every vessel with a shallow draft. River launches, fishing smacks, Thames pleasure cruisers, cockle boats, yachts. Some were taken with their owners' knowledge. Others were gone before their owners returned from work. They were fueled, checked for seaworthiness, and sent to Ramsgate. Within 48 hours, approximately 850 civilian vessels had assembled, a fleet that defied every conventional definition of naval power, carrying names like the Tamzine, less than 15 feet in length, and the smallest boat to make the crossing, alongside Count Dracula and Dumpling and the Medway Queen. They had been built for summer afternoons on the Thames. They were about to cross a German-mined channel under Luftwaffe attack. Churchill authorized Operation Dynamo at 6:57 in the evening on the 26th of May. The signal went out from the tunnel beneath Dover Castle, and the operation began at precisely the moment its central assumption collapsed. On the following morning, the Luftwaffe destroyed what remained of Dunkirk's port facilities in a bombing campaign that rendered the harbor's quays unusable. The original plan had depended on loading men directly from the harbor. 7,669 men were rescued on that first full day. At that rate, the operation would need 44 days to rescue everyone. The Germans would close the perimeter in 4. Captain William Tennant, the senior naval officer appointed to manage the shore end of the evacuation, arrived at Dunkirk on the afternoon of the 27th to find chaos that exceeded even his darkest preparations. Flames consumed the harbor. The town was in ruins. Soldiers were pouring onto the beaches in their hundreds of thousands, exhausted and hungry, many having marched for days to reach the water. The beach itself presented a fundamental geometric problem. The sand shelved so gently that large warships could not approach within several hundred meters of the waterline. Men wading out to the boats were chest-deep in the channel before they reached anything large enough to carry them, and the process of ferrying troops from the shallows to the deeper ships offshore was so slow it seemed designed specifically to fail. Tennant sent an urgent signal to Ramsay at Dover that every available craft, regardless of size or condition, must sail immediately. Then, at 10 o'clock on the evening of the 27th, Tennant made a decision based on nothing more sophisticated than exhausting every other option. At the harbor entrance, extending 1,400 yards into the sea, stood the East Mole, a narrow concrete breakwater built solely to protect the harbor mouth from wave action. It had never been designed to moor vessels against. Its pilings were not rated for the pressure of a ship's hull. No naval architect had imagined it carrying the weight of loaded troop ships. Tennant called in a cross-channel steamer, the Queen of the Channel, and asked its captain to try docking against it in the darkness. Captain Odell eased his ship toward the mole with the controlled nerve that comes from decades at sea. A head rope was made fast. The crew warped her alongside. Tennant watched. The mole held. 600 men shuffled down the narrow walkway and boarded via ladders and gangplanks. The mole still held. Tennant immediately grasped what he had discovered. Over the 9 days that followed, 239,555 men, nearly 2/3 of everyone rescued at Dunkirk, would walk off that breakwater onto waiting ships. The Queen of the Channel was later sunk by a German bomber. The mole was never designed to hold a single ship. It held them all, what the soldiers on the beaches could not understand, and what would generate a fury lasting years and cause men to come to blows in English pubs when they got home, was the question of where the Royal Air Force had gone. German aircraft owned the sky above Dunkirk. Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers equipped with sirens designed to maximize psychological terror screamed down on the beaches in successive waves, their wailing rising and falling as they pulled out of their dives. Ships were sinking. Men were dying in the water. And to every soldier standing on the sand or wading in the shallows, looking up at a sky full of German aircraft and empty of British ones, the conclusion was unavoidable. The Royal Air Force had abandoned them. Charlie Brown, a corporal with the Royal Army Service Corps, later described being under a Stuka attack in words that have never lost their power. You are in a ditch and you say to yourself, "For God's sake, drop your bombs and get it over." They come down one after the other. They have a whistle, the most frightening noise. The whistle was not an accident. German engineers had fitted the Stuka with air-actuated sirens in the undercarriage, precisely because terror was part of the weapon's function. The bombs themselves were often less reliable than the fear they announced. Fighter Command flew 3,500 sorties during the 9 days of Operation Dynamo and lost 177 aircraft. The pilots flying those sorties were engaging German formations at high altitude, inland from the beaches, intercepting bomber groups before they reached the coast. Most of the aerial battle was invisible from the ground, hidden by overcast skies, by smoke that obscured the area above the beaches, and by the simple geographic fact that the decisive engagements were happening miles from where the soldiers were standing. Fighter Command maintained continuous patrols over the evacuation fleet, rotating squadrons in overlapping cycles, but the system created gaps. Because Royal Air Force squadrons were operating from airfields in England rather than from local bases, patrol rotations left windows of as much as 90 minutes when no British aircraft were directly overhead. German formations timed their attacks to exploit those windows. Every soldier on the beach saw German planes because German planes appeared in the gaps, and saw no British aircraft because British aircraft were absent from the gaps by design. What those soldiers witnessed was entirely real. What they concluded from it was not. The men who made it home from Dunkirk did not pause to make that distinction. Some assaulted Royal Air Force airmen in public houses. The resentment was not irrational. It was a perfectly logical inference drawn from genuine terror. It was also deeply unfair to men who had been fighting and dying above the clouds while the army cursed them below. That particular debt, like the debt owed to the French soldiers who stayed behind, would take decades to begin to be properly acknowledged. In London, behind closed doors, A quieter and in some ways more consequential drama was unfolding at the same time. Winston Churchill had been Prime Minister for 16 days when Dynamo began. He had replaced Neville Chamberlain on the 10th of May, the same morning Germany launched its offensive, after the failure of the Norwegian campaign had finally exhausted Parliament's patience. His arrival at Downing Street was neither universally welcomed nor politically secure. He was not the leader of his own party. The Conservative parliamentary majority was loyal to Chamberlain, who remained in the War Cabinet, and to the Foreign Secretary, Edward Wood, the first Earl of Halifax, a man of unimpeachable establishment credentials, quiet authority, and what many colleagues considered admirable realism about Britain's actual strategic position. Halifax's realism in late May of 1940 took an alarming specific form. On the 25th of May, he met secretly with Giuseppe Bastianini, the Italian ambassador to London. Italy had not yet entered the war. Mussolini's government remained officially neutral, maintaining diplomatic contact with both sides. Halifax believed that Mussolini could serve as a mediator, that Italy could broker a negotiated settlement between Britain and Germany before France's imminent collapse left Britain isolated. He brought this proposal to the War Cabinet on the 26th, the same evening Churchill authorized Dynamo. France was collapsing. America was not in the war. The Soviet Union was a German ally. The British Expeditionary Force might not be rescued, or might return in numbers too small to matter. Under these circumstances, Halifax argued, a negotiated peace, even one giving Hitler substantial control over continental Europe, was preferable to a war Britain could not win. Churchill looked at the same facts and drew a different conclusion. He had been thinking with characteristic precision about what German terms would actually require. He told the War Cabinet plainly, the surrender of the British fleet, described as disarmament, the cession of naval bases, the installation of a puppet government in Britain under Mosley or some such person, he said, naming the leader of the British Union of Fascists. He had thought clearly enough about potential national defeat to have privately identified a former prime minister who might serve as a less catastrophic leader of a British vassal state than a genuine fascist, settling on David Lloyd George as the least terrible option. He had stared at the worst possible outcome and thought it through to its end. Then he told the cabinet that the worst possible outcome of continuing to fight was no worse than surrendering now, and that nations which went down fighting rose again, while those which surrendered tamely were finished. Halifax wrote in his diary on the 27th that he thought Churchill was talking the most frightful rot. Between the 25th and the 28th of May, the War Cabinet met 7 times, sometimes twice in a single day, debating with mounting urgency whether Britain should authorize Halifax to pursue the Italian mediation route, which everyone understood as a first step toward a negotiated peace with Germany, or whether Churchill's position would hold. Chamberlain, whose authority over the Conservative majority made him the crucial vote, sat somewhere between the two men. Halifax appeared to have the upper hand. On the afternoon of the 28th, the War Cabinet adjourned its formal session, and Churchill did something that broke with every protocol of cabinet governance. He gathered the full ministerial cabinet of 25, not the inner 5, but every senior minister in the government, and he told them the truth. He described the military situation without softening any of it. He described what German terms would mean for Britain. He said that accepting those terms would reduce the country to a condition from which it could never recover as a free nation. Of course, whatever happens at Dunkirk, we shall fight on, not as a figure of speech, as a policy statement. What followed is one of those moments that happened once in a country's history and was witnessed by none of the ordinary people whose lives it determined. The 25 ministers in that room ran to Churchill's chair and patted him on the back. Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, noted in his diary that evening that no one expressed even the faintest flicker of dissent. Halifax recognized, facing that demonstration, that the political ground had shifted beyond recovery. His proposal was rejected. There would be no approach to Mussolini. Britain would fight on. Churchill's government was secure. 5 votes in a closed room, while the guns were firing 60 miles away. If Halifax had carried 2 more of those votes, if Chamberlain had held his original position, if either of the Labour members had wavered, the history of the century turns on a different axis entirely. The men standing in the water at Dunkirk would not have known whatever the outcome. They knew only what surrounded them. The evacuation found its rhythm across 9 days in a way that no plan had anticipated and no doctrine described. It was not orderly. It was not clean. It was an improvisation of continental scale, held together by individual decisions made under pressure by people with no precedent to consult. The soldiers organized themselves with a discipline that their physical condition made remarkable. Men who had been bombed and shelled and marched to the edge of their endurance formed queues that stretched from the dunes down the sand and into the sea. Sergeant Jack Lowry, waiting in that queue, later wrote in his diary that it felt as if England herself had come for them. Not just the Navy, but their people. On the 28th of May, Belgium surrendered, collapsing the eastern edge of the perimeter and threatening to unravel everything established at such cost. 17,804 men were rescued that day. 2 days later, overcast weather grounded much of the Luftwaffe, and the operation reached its single highest daily total. 53,823 men brought off the beach and the mole in one day. On the 31st of May, 68,014 men were evacuated, the largest single day of the entire operation, while 35,000 French troops were simultaneously taken prisoner at Lille, 100 kilometers south, their sacrifice buying the time that those 68,000 needed. Those French soldiers at Lille were one part of a sacrifice that British popular memory of Dunkirk has almost entirely erased. 6 French divisions gave themselves at Lille to delay the German assault on the evacuation perimeter by 4 days. Without those 4 days, the mole and the beaches might have been closed before the bulk of the British Expeditionary Force reached them. On the perimeter itself, 16 British infantry battalions and more than 40,000 French troops held their positions against German artillery and infantry with orders that left nothing ambiguous. Fight to the last man and the last round. The soldiers who received those orders understood what they meant. They were covering an evacuation most of them would not be part of. They accepted this with a stoicism that the official histories have consistently undervalued. At La Bassée, the 1st Battalion Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders held their section of the canal line for 2 days, repelling German crossing attempts in engagements so close that they could hear orders being given on the opposite bank. During the night of the 1st of June, a company commander named Marcus Irvine Andrews gathered a handful of volunteers, climbed onto the thatched roof of a barn, and held off a German assault using a Bren gun, defending 1,000 yards of territory that a single light machine gun and 12 men had no business holding. He received the Victoria Cross. He was one among thousands who made the same essential choice in those final days, and whose names appear on no monument in any capital city. The small boats came. They came from fishing harbors and Thames marinas and the quays at Ramsgate, crewed by Royal Navy personnel and by civilians who had declined to let someone else go instead. A fisherman from Deal asked afterward why he had kept crossing under Stuka attack, said they just kept going back because they were their boys. The little ships were not, in the end, the primary instrument of rescue. That distinction belongs to Tennant's Mole and to the Royal Navy destroyers shuttling back and forth across the channel at maximum speed. Perhaps 5% of the men were rescued directly by the civilian boats, but the little ships reached where the destroyers could not. They worked the shallows. They took men off the sand in groups of 4 and 6 and 10, ferrying them to the larger vessels offshore, working under fire with no armor and no weapons of their own. The romance attached to the Dunkirk little ships is not false. It is simply incomplete as an account of what actually happened, which is more complicated and in certain respects more extraordinary than the popular version. The operation's cruelest single moment came on the 29th of May, when the destroyer HMS Wakeful was cut in half by a torpedo from a German E-boat, breaking apart so fast that most of her crew and the soldiers aboard had no time to respond. The destroyer HMS Grafton came to assist and was herself torpedoed while stationary in the water. 2 ships lost in the same location within an hour, their men dying in the same dark sea while the Mole behind them kept loading. Ramsay, working through the night at Dover, received a mistaken signal suggesting the harbor was completely blocked by burning wreckage. The Admiralty in London was already pressing him to withdraw his destroyers, worried about losses that could compromise Britain's ability to defend against the German invasion that everyone expected to follow. He acknowledged the pressure. He sent the ships back anyway. On the 3rd of June, the last of the British Army left Dunkirk. Tennant transmitted a signal to Ramsay at 10:50 in the morning. Operation completed, returning to Dover. Churchill, receiving the news, immediately insisted the Royal Navy return for the French troops who remained. The Navy went back that night. On the 4th of June, the last day of Operation Dynamo, 26,175 French soldiers were brought off the harbor and the beaches. Between 30,000 and 40,000 more, men who had held the perimeter so that others could walk to the Mole, were left behind. They became prisoners of war. The Germans raised the swastika over Dunkirk's docks. At 2:23 in the afternoon, Ramsay's operations room at Dover received the signal that the operation had concluded. Ramsay drove to the golf course at Sandwich and played a round in the late afternoon. He shot a 78, the best score of his life. That evening he wrote to his wife that the relief was stupendous and the results were beyond belief. The final count was 338,226 men rescued over 9 days, against a plan for 45,000 over 2, against the best estimate of 30,000 from one of the most senior officers involved in the planning, against every calculation that had been applied to the problem before it began. The achievement was real and extraordinary, and Winston Churchill stood in the House of Commons on the evening of the 4th of June and told the British people something they would never forget about fighting on beaches and landing grounds and fields and streets and hills. He also said something the newspapers reported with rather less enthusiasm. We must be very careful not to assign to this deliverance the attributes of a victory. Wars are not won by evacuations. He meant every word. The British Expeditionary Force had left behind 475 tanks, 38,000 vehicles, and 2,500 guns. Britain had no meaningful ground force left capable of defending its territory against the invasion Churchill fully expected to follow. France surrendered 3 weeks later. Of the French soldiers evacuated through Dunkirk, the majority were returned to France shortly afterward and were killed or captured when France fell. For many of them, Dunkirk had been not a rescue, but a brief postponement of the same outcome. Hitler announced to his generals on the 5th of June that the greatest battle in the history of the world had come to an end. The German High Command called it the greatest annihilation battle of all time. They believed it. They were wrong about what it meant. What it meant was this: 338,000 soldiers were not merely statistics. They were a professional army's accumulated experience, men who had been tested under real conditions, who needed months to re-equip, but only weeks to reorganize. They were the core around which everything that followed would be built. In North Africa, in Sicily, at Normandy, the army that eventually turned the tide in Western Europe was constructed on a foundation of men who had stood in the water at Dunkirk and waited for boats that should never have arrived. The man who sent those boats never received the recognition his work warranted. Bertram Ramsay continued in the service of an institution that had once discarded him, and Dynamo was only the beginning of what history would demand. By the autumn of 1942, he was Deputy Naval Commander for the Allied landings in North Africa. In July of 1943, he commanded the British landing operations in Sicily. In the spring of 1944, he was appointed Allied Naval Commander-in-Chief for the invasion of Normandy. He coordinated a fleet of 4,126 vessels that delivered 160,000 men onto the beaches of Normandy on the 6th of June, 1944 alone, and over 1 million Allied soldiers in the first month of operations. Eisenhower later described the planning as a never-surpassed masterpiece. He also called Ramsay his warm personal friend. Ramsay did not live to see the war end. On the 2nd of January, 1945, his plane crashed on takeoff near Paris. He was 61 years old, killed 6 months before the German surrender, without a memoir, without the public recognition given to his contemporaries, without a place in the victory photographs alongside Eisenhower and Churchill. His papers were deposited at Churchill College, Cambridge, by his son in 1986. A statue was erected at Dover Castle in November of 2000, near the tunnels where he had worked without proper sleep for 9 days in late May of 1940. He remains the forgotten man of British military history. The man who brought the army home in 1940 and sent it back to France in 1944. Today, at the southeastern corner of the town of Dunkirk, 4,504 names are inscribed on a memorial erected by the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, soldiers of the British Expeditionary Force who died there and have no known grave. Nearby, a marble inscription in French reads, "To the glorious memory of the pilots, mariners, and soldiers of the French and Allied armies who sacrificed themselves in the Battle of Dunkirk, May to June 1940. In Britain, the phrase Dunkirk spirit has entered the language as a permanent shorthand for collective resolve in the face of overwhelming odds. It describes something real that happened in those 9 days, a quality of improvised determination that genuinely existed in the fisherman from Deal, and the admiral at his golf course, and the man on the thatched barn roof with his Bren gun, and the 600 soldiers who walked down a concrete breakwater in the dark, not knowing if it would take their weight. What the phrase leaves out is the 40,000 French soldiers who stayed when the British left. the men who held the perimeter so that others could reach the boats, whose sacrifice made the phrase possible, and whose names are not woven into the British version of it. 338,000 men walked off a beach that was supposed to be their grave. They did it because one admiral who had been thrown out of the Navy in 1935 refused to accept the arithmetic of impossibility. Because a concrete breakwater that was never meant to hold ships held them all. Because a German general was ordered to stop 15 miles short of the prize by a decision whose full rationale may never be established. Because thousands of soldiers whose names nobody celebrated stayed in the water and held the line so that other men could go home. Because 5 people in a room in London voted against surrender on the 28th of May, and the margin was thin enough that the world we live in now rests on it. That is the thing about Dunkirk that the comfortable myth obscures. It was not inevitable. It was not the expression of some superior national character or providential destiny. It was a sequence of decisions made under conditions of extreme uncertainty by people who had no guarantee of the outcome, and it succeeded by a margin so narrow that changing any single element, the weather, the halt order, the cabinet vote, the mole, changes everything that followed. The miracle of Dunkirk is not that Britain was strong enough. The miracle is that when the margin was this thin, it held. Now you know exactly how thin that margin really was.